an unfolding process. What we call a sunset is moments of shifting movement and patterns of light and shadow and color. Can you hold the thing you call a sunset? Philosopher Alan Watts summed this up beautifully. He said, if you try to capture running water in a bucket, it is clear that you do not understand it and you will always be disappointed. For in the bucket, the water does not run. To have running water, you must let go of it and let it run. The same is true of life and God. So we must not try to capture the running water of our real experience, of what can truly be known only as it is experienced, in the bucket of our concepts. Concepts freeze our can and experience. They do not let it be what it is. And that certainly includes the concept of I or me. The Buddha's teaching on anicca, or constant changingness, which is one of the three characteristics of all we experience, makes this point. Everything is constantly changing. Even the most solid appearing mountain is changing. It is constantly being eroded in some places and perhaps having bulk added in other places. The vegetation on it is always shifting and changing, and so on. Nothing we can name or think of in our earthly or cosmic experience ever stays the same. Only Nibbana or God, which is beyond both of these. Now, this is certainly true. This never stays the same of what I call me. Biologists tell us that no cell in our body lasts beyond 7 years. As cells die, they are replaced using the protein building blocks we have eaten, according to the genetic code that's contained in all the cells of our body. Mistakes occur, of course, in this reproduction, and this is what we call aging. The reproducibility of what we were when younger has faltered and will continue to falter until finally, unless some accident or disease gets us first, what is reproduced can no longer sustain life. Then the material process called me ceases. But it's always ceasing. Part of what I called me when I woke up this morning already went down the drain when I showered and dead skin cells flaked off. What I called rice at lunch yesterday is in the process of becoming what I call me tomorrow. Not only our bodies, but also anything else we might call me is in constant flux. Emotions, thoughts, even memories. Yes, even memories change because we are constantly rearranging how we recall the past. So, just as Rogers said, the Buddha said, we are a process, not a thing. More than that, we are not an isolated process, because the process that we are interlocks with many other ongoing processes. The exchange of solid matter, those dead skin cells in the rice, of fluids, of gases, the very air we breathe in and the breath we expel. This interchange with the larger environmental process is constant. Scientists who study chaos, the apparent random chance occurrences in the universe, say that if we only look close enough, we find that everything is interrelated. And there is really nothing that can be called an accident. Everything is caused, the Buddha would say conditioned, by all the interlocking processes going on that affect it. These scientists who study chaos describe what they call the butterfly effect. How a butterfly, fluttering its wings in Hong Kong in January, affects weather patterns in Minnesota the next summer. There's an amazing interlocking of processes. Truly, as the poet said, not one of us is an island. We're all connected. When the Buddha said that there are no fixed essences or things, he meant that there is nothing that is not a constantly changing process, which is constantly affected by the larger cosmic process going on, of which it is a part. This includes I or me. What we call ourselves are not fixed, unchanging entities. They're simply interlocking processes which interlock with still larger processes. Now let's see what St. John of the Cross says about all of this. We're going to look at something that he calls the substance of the soul. What is left when we peel away everything that does not last. St. John worked from a Thomistic philosophy based on Aristotle that said that we have to distinguish between the substance or real reality of a thing and what are called the accidents, those qualities or characteristics that are passing, that don't last. Both Buddhists and St. John recognize the passing nature of our bodies, our emotions, our thoughts, even what we call our personality, because that's just a combination of our memories, thoughts, reactions, emotions. None of these things about us is really lastingly real. They come into existence, clustering together, are constantly changing, and then drop away, separating from the process that I call me. I want to give you a few quotes about the substance of the soul from St. John. He speaks of how the unpurified soul experiences the touches of God. In the substance of the soul, one suffers abandonment, supreme poverty, dryness, cold, and sometimes heat. One finds relief in nothing, nor is there a thought that consoles one. And then after purification, the soul can say, "You are no longer heavy and constringent to the substance of my soul, but rather its glory and delight and amplitude." Here are a few other comments on this topic from St. John. This touch of God gives intense satisfaction and enjoyment to the substance of the soul. And, rejoicing the substance of my soul with the torrent of your delight by your divine contact and substantial union. And, touches in the substance of the soul are usually an exceptionally sublime and delightful perception of God. If we put together all that St. John said about the substance of the soul, it seems pretty clear that what he's talking about is merely the capacity to experience God. When we peel away everything about I or me that is an accident, everything that won't last, what we have left, the only real reality that's left, is this capacity to experience God. All that will remain in the end is this knowing of God. From St. John, the soul is transformed in God. In this transformation, she drinks of God in her substance. John also speaks of the center of the soul in a way that suggests there are different depths at which the substance of the soul is touched or transformed into God. He says, the soul's center is God. When it has reached God with all the capacity of its being and the strength of its operation and inclination, it will have attained to its final and deepest center in God. Let's look a little more now at understanding this idea of no self. How very similar the teachings of the Buddha and St. John are. In the Buddhist philosophy, the processes that go to make up what we consider ourselves to be are threefold. There are the processes occurring in matter, which make up our bodies, which St. John would consider, of course, accidents attached to the substance of the soul. There are the processes of mind states, which include things like emotions, perception, impulses, etc. Again, in St. John's terminology, accidents, not the really real, lasting reality. And there are the processes of consciousness, the knowing faculty. Matter, mind states, consciousness. In Buddhist thought, these three clustered together make up what we call me. They're all processes. When the consciousness is finally purified, and one is at the end of one's last lifetime, this consciousness fixes on Nibbana at the time of death. And then this dying into Nibbana is all that there is. Nibbana is the Buddhist ultimate reality, the one reality that is not conditioned, is not constantly changing, is not without essence, and is not unsatisfactory. The reality that is the unborn, the undying. The reality that clearly corresponds to the idea of the ultimate Godhead of Christian mystics. So, we have in the end, according to the Buddhist thought, consciousness fixed on Nibbana, or, in terms of St. John of the Cross, the substance of the soul, knowing God. Everything else that we would call me or I is transient, is unimportant, will go back to the dust or the energy from which it was drawn. I repeat, in the end, the consciousness dying into Nibbana, or the substance of the soul knowing God. That's what's left in the end. Another Buddhist teaching mirrors what St. John taught about the different depths of the center of the soul, because in Buddhist thought, prior to the full and final purification, but past a certain point of purification, one can touch Nibbana at different degrees of depth or intensity according to the level of purification that has occurred. Just as John taught that there's different degrees of the centeredness in which the soul can know God. What are these teachings common to mystics in all traditions actually telling us? That most of what we fret about and concern ourselves with as me is simply passing phenomenon that we can't in the final end hold on to anyway. What is really real and lasting, Nibbana, our God, is in no way destructible regardless of what we do or do not do. And that what the I or me will ultimately come to is just this knowing or touching or dwelling in that which is really real and indestructible. Nibbana, our God. Everything apart from that goes. It's a process that falls apart. And it also tells us that we come to this only when there is utter purity of heart. And that one of the main obstacles to this purity is my clinging to and trying to enhance that pitiful combination of changing processes that I call I or me. Contemporary mystic Simone Weil said something that applies here. She said, all sin is simply an attempt to fill the emptiness with something other than God. Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. Now I want to look at an old-fashioned word, sacrifice. Sacrifice seems somehow to be an eternal law of nature. It has to do with willingly embracing death for the sake of greater life. Within all our bodies, there's a constant interchange of smaller lives, of tissues and organs with the larger life of the body. We have already looked at how parts of our bodies are constantly dying back into the universe with each exhalation, with each dying skin cell sloughing off, feeding back into that larger process of which we're all a part, and also drawing from that larger process. There's a constant interchange of smaller individual lives with the larger one in which everything has its being. You could call it the mystical body of the Christ. If the individual cell in my body were to refuse to die, or were to attempt to grow overbig or overburden itself, a disease process sets in that destroys the entire body. Cancer is nothing but the individual cell aggrandizing itself at the expense of the entire body. The sacrifice of the self-sense is similar to the sacrifice needed to maintain our bodies, the sacrifice of the lives of individual cells needed to maintain the larger life. Sacrifice of the self-sense is needed to realize that larger cosmic process of which all the processes I call me are a part. This is what Kalu Rinpoche was saying. When we realize that we are nothing, no thing, we're not some separate thing or entity, we truly understand that we are everything. We're in and of and are that larger process going on. In itself, this kind of expansion of awareness brings tremendous comfort, joy, and peace. We also have the word of those who know, who have seen, that this surrender also opens that straight and narrow gate to our fullest life, to Nibbana, our God. The lesser must always be let go of for the greater. We Christians have a beautiful example of this letting go of self that must happen in our understanding of the Christ. The whole life of Jesus can be seen as his giving us what is necessary for our salvation by dying in order to show us how to live, thus teaching us the necessity of living in relinquishment of self. I've long been convinced that the salvation that Jesus won for us is the salvation in this lesson. Let us start with this from the 2nd chapter of the Epistle to the Philippians. Have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant and being made in human likeness, and humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Until we come to a full balance of complete surrender, sacrifice will involve suffering. We have further in the example of the Christ. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered, and having been made perfect, he became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation. Hebrews 5:8-9. These are profound words on the mission of Jesus, who told us to do exactly as he had done. If we wish to follow him, we are to deny ourselves, to take up the cross, for if we should try to save our life, we will surely lose it. Only in freely surrendering the small, petty life of the self do we find the fullness of life. This annihilation of clinging in Jesus was complete, to the point of utter nakedness in the cry from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" St. John of the Cross says that here was the most extreme abandonment sensitively that he had suffered in his life, and by it he accomplished the most marvelous work of his whole life. It is from this that we see the total nakedness into which we must come, that emptying out in faith of all our ideas, notions, memories, opinions that we would cling to for comfort and security, that emptying out in love of all disordered appetite, of any clinging to that which would enhance or gratify the me. Jesus emptied himself out, not clinging even to being in the form of God. Of course, this relinquishing of self is not easy. St. John of the Cross understood this. He said, "Ordinarily, the losing and annihilation of self, which brings the most profit to us, will be considered the worst for us, whereas consolation and satisfaction, which are of less value, and ordinarily involving loss rather than gain if attachment is involved, will be considered the best." St. John is saying we just simply don't understand. We're really in our best condition when we're the most emptied out, when we have nothing to hold on to. The Buddha also understood how hard it is, but he said to his followers that he would not ask it were it not possible. Our emptying out over and over again in this meditation practice is the Buddha's proven way of doing it. And Buddhist teachers also know that we're in our best condition when we're our most emptied out. We experience the deep void and hunger in ourselves. Often we do try to fill it with something other than God, which Simone Weil said that's what sin is. Especially we try to fill it with the trappings of self. But St. John of the Cross was very clear in telling us what will satisfy our hunger. He said, "The intellect, its void is thirst for the waters of God's wisdom, the object of the intellect. The hunger of the will for God is so immense that it makes the soul faint, for the perfection of love after which the soul aims. The void of the memory is a yearning and melting away of the soul for possession of God. Their capacity is infinite, their thirst is infinite, their hunger is also deep and infinite. That within us, which is left when the accidents go, that which can have the loving knowledge of God, that which can touch Nibbana. That infinite capacity. In order to have this infinite capacity filled, we have again Jesus' instruction. Unless the grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it will not bear fruit. That little grain of wheat which each one of us is, the spiritual task is to relinquish it to its death. The task is stupendous. The reward is indescribable." In closing, I want to give you a little poem that's based on a Sufi teaching, which also understands this. I knocked. God asked, "Who's there?" "It's I, my God," I said. "I've come to know, love, serve." God answered not. I knocked. God asked, "Who's there?" "It is your very self, my God, come back to be at one." The door stood open wide. May we all yield the little self we each are to death, to find the fruits of, to put on, to be transformed into God's knowing and loving. May we all be surrendered to the Dhamma, to the purifying action of the Holy Spirit.